For 3 years I thought we were building a future together, until I found the birth control pills. That was the first crack in the lie, but what I discovered next. It didn't just end my marriage, it exposed a secret so big, it destroyed everything she had. My name is Raymond, and for most of my life, people have considered me an unusually lucky guy. I suppose in many ways they weren't wrong. I'm just an ordinary Irish man, nothing particularly special about me, but until I was 38, I had just about everything a man could ask for. A wonderful wife, 2 beautiful daughters, a comfortable home, great friends, a solid job, and even a brand new car. Even my bets on the horses tended to go my way, not that I ever won a fortune, but as the old saying goes, a little makes a mickle. I had enough to enjoy life's small luxuries. I wasn't born into wealth or privilege, everything I had I worked hard for. But I won't pretend I did it all alone. Sandra, my wife, played a huge role in building the life we had. Without her by my side, things would have been much tougher. We first met on a winter holiday in St. Anton, Austria. I had gone with 3 friends, and one evening during a après-ski at our hotel, we found ourselves seated at a large table with 2 stunning Irish girls. Boys will be boys, and my friends immediately began competing for the most striking of the 2, a classic 9 out of 10. That left Sandra, a solid 7 according to their scoring, to me with no competition. At first, my friends saw her as the consolation prize, but they quickly realized they had misjudged her. When one of them succeeded in winning over the so-called trophy, the others suddenly took notice of Sandra, but by then it was too late, she had already chosen me. To everyone's surprise, our connection lasted the entire trip. When my friend jokingly suggested we swap partners after a few days, I declined without hesitation. After returning home, Sandra and I kept in touch, and our relationship grew stronger. A few months later, I decided to move to her hometown, where I landed a job as a plumber. Years later, when my boss decided to retire to sunny Spain, I bought both his business and his house, setting myself up for the future. Sandra and I married 2 years after meeting, and for all those years, I had never once thought about being unfaithful. That is, until recently. The idea that Sandra could ever betray me was something I struggled to wrap my head around. As beautiful as she was, I knew she must have received her fair share of advances over the years. But I had always believed in us, in the life we had built together. And then I met Marie-Louise. Looking back, that moment changed everything, not just for me but for several people in our lives. It all started at a training course for a new version of the administration software I used at work. The course was structured so that participants worked in pairs, likely to make things easier for the instructor by reducing the number of questions. My assigned partner, Marie-Louise, hadn't arrived when the session began, but the consultant assured me she was on her way. Hearing her name, I immediately pictured an older woman, someone in her 60s maybe. The kind of lady who had a sharp sense of humor and an unexpected enthusiasm for learning new technology. I had met a few like that before and I was fine with it. Then, about 10 minutes later, the youngest, and, without question, the most attractive, woman in the class walked in. She introduced herself as Marie-Louise and took the seat next to me. From the start, she was bright, confident, and easy to talk to. We picked up the material quickly, which left us plenty of time to chat between exercises. She told me she was 25 years old and handled administrative work for the most prestigious women's fashion boutique in her hometown. The course lasted 2 days, and at the end of the first day she was the one who suggested we go out for dinner. I knew a nice restaurant in town and we ended up having a great time, good food, easy conversation, and a sense of connection that I hadn't expected. Afterward, back at the hotel, Marie-Louise confided in me about her relationship. She had a boyfriend, by all accounts a decent guy, but they were facing growing issues that she didn't know how to handle. She admitted she didn't have anyone in her hometown she could open up to about something so personal, but for some reason she felt she could trust me. I listened, trying to be supportive, and when I suggested we continue the conversation at the hotel bar, she hesitated. Instead, she softly proposed her room where we could talk in private. I suggested we go to her room, and once inside we sat at the small table. She adjusted the lights to a dim glow, creating an intimate, almost somber atmosphere. Then she began to talk. She told me about her boyfriend, a good-looking, well-mannered man who, in many ways, seemed like the perfect partner. But beneath the surface, there was a deep issue that had been weighing on her for a long time. Their sex life, or rather the lack of it, was a constant source of frustration for her. As she spoke, her voice wavered and she couldn't hold back the tears. I let her talk, giving her the space to pour out what she had clearly been holding in for so long. Here's the short version of the much longer story she shared with me. When they first met, she had been impressed by his restraint. He was a true gentleman, respectful, never pushing things physically, which at first made her proud to be with someone who valued more than just the physical side of a relationship. But as weeks turned into months with no sign of intimacy, she began to worry. Something felt off. 2 months in, she finally confronted him, asking why he never made any move toward deepening their relationship physically. His response? He wanted to wait until marriage. But to Marie-Louise, that wasn't an answer she could accept. She told him plainly that there wouldn't be a wedding night if their relationship lacked passion and intimacy. Marriage, to her, had to include a fulfilling physical connection, and she needed to know they were compatible before making a lifelong commitment. He took her words to heart, but when they finally tried to be intimate, it was a disaster. The pressure overwhelmed him and every attempt failed. Hoping to ease the tension, she suggested they try watching some risque videos together, thinking it might help him relax. But instead of engaging, he was disgusted. He told her that kind of thing went against everything he believed in. At this point, their relationship had settled into an awkward, unspoken stalemate. Marie-Louise admitted that she lacked enough experience in her past relationships to guide them through the issue, and over time, they had just stopped trying. She felt stuck, unhappy but unsure of what to do next. Then she asked me a personal question. She wanted to know how things had been between my wife and me when we first met. I told her the truth. Sandra and I had met at a hotel during a winter holiday, and within hours we had ended up in bed together. There had been no hesitation, no second-guessing. It just felt right from the start. Marie-Louise listened intently, nodding slowly as if processing what she had been missing in her own relationship. Not long after, I left her room. As I stepped into the hallway, the door to the neighboring room creaked open. A middle-aged woman stood there, eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Then, with a voice filled with judgment, she sneered, "Shame on you." I didn't say a word. I just walked away. But deep down, I knew she wasn't entirely wrong. I didn't care. The next morning, I met Marie-Louise at breakfast, and the whole experience felt exhilarating, lighthearted. There was no guilt, no heaviness, just the thrill of something new. Breakfast with her was effortless, like we were two people who had known each other for years. The course wrapped up at noon, and before we had to check out, we sneaked up to my room for one last moment together. A quick, heated encounter before heading back to reality. Before leaving, we exchanged phone numbers and addresses, agreeing to stay in touch as friends. To my great surprise, I didn't feel much remorse for what I had done. I told myself it had been a choice, something that felt right in the moment. And I wasn't going to second-guess it. But reality had other plans. When I arrived home, I walked into a storm. Sandra was in the kitchen, her face red with fury, her voice sharp as a blade. Before I could even put my bags down, she erupted. "Take your suitcases and go to hell, or wherever you prefer. But you are not staying in this house." There was no doubt about the reason for her anger. She didn't need to spell it out, I already knew. "How could you do this to me? To our children?" she screamed, her voice cracking with hurt. "I never thought you'd be the kind of cheap creep who throws away everything for some fling." People had seen. People had talked. Word had gotten back to her. My attempts to calm her down were useless. The more I tried, the more enraged she became. I could only hope that she hadn't managed to track down Marie-Louise's boyfriend and dump this mess on him too. With no other choice, I packed a bag and left. I moved into her parents' house. Temporarily, I told myself. I still went to work as usual, still spoke with my kids every day. But I never asked what Sandra had told them. I didn't want to put them in the middle of this. All they knew was what she had told them. Sometimes adults need time apart. Dad will come home soon. I took that as a small sign of hope. At least she wasn't turning the kids against me. Marie-Louise and I stayed in touch, though cautiously. When I mentioned to her that by next week both of us might be out of our relationships for good, there was a shift in her voice, a mix of relief and something else. "Let's just hope Sandra doesn't do anything stupid," she said softly. And for the first time since this all began, I wasn't sure if she meant that for my sake, or hers. I asked her, "And what will you do if that happens?" She laughed lightly. "Find Mr. Right and get married." Her answer caught me off guard. "Get married?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Whoever he is, he'll be the luckiest man on earth." Marie-Louise shook her head with a playful smirk. "Not yet. He doesn't know about it yet." I laughed, but before I could say anything else, she continued. "Look, my feelings for you haven't faded. But I need time. I want to date you for a while before I make any final decisions about our future." She then hit me with an unexpected proposal. "What about starting our new relationship with a date? My annual company party is tonight, and I've already put you on the guest list. Spouses are invited, but if you don't mind, I want you to come as my date. I hesitated for a moment. The rational side of me told me to focus on fixing my marriage, but a part of me, one I wasn't ready to admit existed, felt a pull toward Marie-Louise. I'm going to do everything I can to save my marriage, I finally said. Good, she replied. I think if we can at least avoid arguing, it's a step in the right direction. I'll try, I told her. I look forward to a pleasant evening. Me too, she said, as long as you accept my conditions. But the evening took an unexpected turn. That night I drove to Nellie's house, Sandra's friend, to pick up my wife. I was barely on time, but as I pulled up, I saw her stepping out of the house, giggling with another woman and two men. She slid into the back seat, sitting between the two men. One of them casually draped his arm around her shoulders, his hand resting behind her neck. They continued whispering and laughing together, acting as if I wasn't even there. I clenched the steering wheel. The whole situation felt like a deliberate performance, one meant to provoke me. Then, as if the tension in the car wasn't enough, the man in the front seat pulled out a cigarette and lit it. This is a smoke-free trip, I said firmly. To my surprise, instead of putting it out, he scoffed and started arguing. The others, Sandra included, burst into laughter as if it was all some big joke. That was it, I snapped. With a voice loud enough to turn heads from people passing by, I shouted, "Get out of my car before I count to 3. They weren't expecting that. Their laughter stopped, but Sandra's so-called boyfriend, the one sitting beside her, didn't move. He just smirked at me like he was daring me to do something. 1. No reaction. 2. Still nothing. 3. Without hesitation, I turned and landed a solid punch straight to his face. The impact sent him flying back into his seat, his body jerking as he tried to steady himself. The laughter was gone. The smug attitude disappeared. And for the first time that night there was silence. I gripped his hair with my left hand, but he jerked away before I could get a proper hold. The moment passed and I let him go. There was no point in escalating things further, not with Sandra sitting there, acting as if none of this mattered. I drove in silence, my mind racing. Something about the whole night felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. When I finally got home, I walked into the kitchen and noticed a tray on the counter with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. But here's what caught my attention. There were 2 glasses on the tray and a third one set off to the side as if someone had been using it earlier. Why 3 glasses? A strange feeling crept over me. My gut told me to look around the house more closely. I walked through the living room, nothing seemed unusual there. But when I stepped into the bedroom, everything changed. The bed was covered with a brand new red sheet, and on each nightstand sat a large bouquet of red roses. The entire room had been carefully arranged, made up for a romantic evening. The only question was, who was the lucky man? After Sandra's behavior earlier that night, it was hard to believe she had done all this for me. Could it have been that idiot I'd punched in the car? Was she planning to bring him here after their little night out? Everything was starting to make sense now. Still, I needed more proof. Sandra had mentioned earlier that she and Nellie were heading to a union party in their hometown. But after what I had just witnessed, I started wondering if that was just another lie. If they weren't at that party, where were they? And more importantly, what were they doing? I searched around for anything that could confirm my suspicions. I started looking through Sandra's personal belongings, not something I would have done before, but given the circumstances, I wasn't going to let guilt stop me. At first, I found nothing unusual in her drawers. Just the usual clothes, paperwork, and miscellaneous items. But then, tucked away in the back of a closet, I found something that made my stomach turn. A small envelope filled with photographs. I pulled them out and began flipping through them. The first one nearly made me drop the stack. Sandra standing next to a completely naked male stripper in a dimly lit bar. It must have been after hours because there was no one else in the background. The guy had placed his massive piece on a bar stool and there was Sandra, wearing nothing but a bra and panties, laughing as she measured it using crown coins. I couldn't tell exactly how many coins she had stacked, but the fact that she was even doing it sent a wave of rage through me. The next photo was even worse. Nellie, completely topless, wearing nothing but a pair of panties, posing with Sandra, both of them laughing like this was all just a fun little game. The final 2 pictures looked like they had been taken in a hotel room. I stared at them, my hands shaking. It was one thing to suspect Sandra had been unfaithful, but seeing it with my own eyes? That was something else entirely. I took a deep breath, trying to process what I was looking at. I had my answer now. There was no salvaging this marriage. I put the photos back in the envelope and placed them where I had found them. I wasn't ready to confront Sandra yet, not without a clear plan. But one thing was certain. The life I thought I had? It was over. I have to admit, despite everything that had happened, I was oddly grateful for my time at that course. If nothing else, it had led me to the undeniable truth that I was married to a woman I could no longer trust. Sandra wasn't the person I had believed her to be. And now, knowing the truth, I would be free from her much sooner than I ever could have imagined. Without that course, I might have spent years in the dark. I sent a message to Marie-Louise. Call me when you can. I have one of the most unbelievable true stories you'll ever hear. She rang me early the next morning and I told her everything. Meanwhile, Sandra also called, but this wasn't a conversation. It was damage control. Ray, you have to believe me, it's not what you think, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. I kept my tone calm. No, Sandra. I'm afraid it's actually much worse than I thought. Goodbye. She called back 10 minutes later, this time not to argue, but to demand her car, clothes, and a few other things. I agreed to gather everything she asked for, loaded it into the car, and parked it on the street with the key left under the wheel. As a final touch, I tossed her little special collection into the trunk. She could decide what to do with it. She arrived in a taxi, took her car, and left without a word. Marie-Louise called again later, suggesting we meet up. We ended up spending the weekend together, discussing everything that had happened and, surprisingly, sorting through all of our lingering concerns without any real conflict. When we did have differences of opinion, they were resolved with a bit of compromise, a give and take that felt natural and effortless. By the time I returned home, I felt 10 years younger. Sandra, meanwhile, had been back to the house while I was away. She had taken more of her belongings and left a note on the kitchen table. Read, "Dear Ray, I love you, but..." I didn't need to read any further. Whatever excuses, regrets, or explanations she had written, they no longer mattered. At this point, the decisions had already been made. There was nothing left for Sandra to change, only minor details to settle. The final meeting. That Tuesday evening, Sandra and I met at a restaurant, both arriving on time. We were seated in a discreet booth, and I suggested that we hold off on the serious discussions until after we had eaten. As we sat across from each other, I found myself taking a good look at her. She was still a stunning woman, no doubt about it. A part of me wondered, if I had never met Marie-Louise, if I had never found those pictures, would I be sitting here, still willing to fight for our marriage? But the truth was clear. Some things, once broken, can never be put back together. If I hadn't found out the truth, if I had never come across those pictures, I probably would have tried to save our marriage. I would have convinced myself that we could somehow fix things. After the meal, Sandra looked at me with a softer expression and said, "I was actually planning to surprise you that night. The bedroom, the flowers, the champagne, the strawberries, all of it was meant for you. It was my way of trying to rekindle what we had, to give us a fresh start. That's the simple truth." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. "Then why were there 3 champagne glasses?" She hesitated for a moment, then quickly replied, "One of them had a crack. That's the only reason." It sounded like a reasonable explanation, but by now, I had learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts were telling me that she wasn't being completely honest. "Sandra," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I regret to say that there are too many weak points in your story. I don't think you've told me the whole truth." Her face tensed, her confident demeanor cracking for the first time. She knew the game was coming to an end. I decided there was no point in dragging things out any longer. I went straight to the heart of the matter. "Sandra, I'll admit that I made a terrible mistake when I comforted Marie-Louise and let things go too far. There are no excuses for cheating. But I don't regret what happened because it led me to the truth. The truth that you have been lying to me for a long time, using drugs, cheating behind my back, making a fool of me while I was busy trying to hold our life together." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "I was really in love with you, Sandra," I continued, my voice steady. "I loved you right up until that night at the union party. That was the moment I realized, you were never mine to begin with." She lowered her head, staring at the table. I didn't feel anger anymore. Just closure. The aftermath. After I left the restaurant, I drove home and sat in silence, processing everything. I had known this meeting wouldn't change the outcome, but it had been necessary. Now there was no turning back. After resting for an hour, I called Marie-Louise. She had gone through her own painful breakup and understood exactly what I was feeling. We talked for hours, our conversation weaving between the sadness of endings and the quiet hope of new beginnings. The next day, I decided that some things deserved consequences. I printed copies of Nellie's scandalous photos and mailed them, anonymously, to her husband along with a short letter. Dear name? I didn't appreciate the way you and your wife humiliated me at the union party. Now it's my turn to have a laugh. Enjoy the pictures. The final blow. A few days later I saw Sandra again. But this time there was something different about her. A large black bruise covered one side of her face. I looked at her and she looked at me. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then with a quiet but knowing voice I said, "I know what happened." She studied my expression carefully before finally asking, "It was you, wasn't it?" I met her gaze without hesitation. Yes. And honestly, it feels good knowing she got exactly what she deserved. I didn't send those photos anonymously. I signed my name at the bottom of the letter so that Nellie's husband would know exactly who had sent them. I didn't care if Sandra's husband, or anyone else, accused her of being involved. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about truth. Despite everything, Sandra and I managed to come to a fair agreement about custody. To my relief, she agreed to completely cut ties with drugs in order to keep our daughters in her care. In the end, we settled things without much hostility, and for that I was grateful. The full truth. But just when I thought I had heard it all, Sandra finally admitted something that had been weighing on her. She had cheated on me for the first time early in our marriage. She told me that it happened at a bar, after a night out with Nellie. What started as harmless fun quickly turned into something else when Nellie, who was infatuated with the bartender, convinced Sandra to stay after hours. One thing led to another, and while Nellie disappeared into a hotel room with her bartender, Sandra stayed behind with the bar owner, and betrayed me. She swore she had been consumed by guilt afterward, that she had regretted it deeply. But when Nellie asked her to go back to the same bar on another trip, she agreed, this time fully aware of what might happen. Was it the same bartender? I asked, already knowing the answer. Sandra nodded, her expression blank. Yes. He had curly yellow hair. It was strange hearing her confess so openly now after all these years. It no longer hurt the way it might have before. I had moved past the pain, past the betrayal. The only thing I felt now was a sense of finality. Moving forward. Sandra eventually rented a 4-room apartment and was granted custody of our daughters. But unlike so many bitter separations, she never tried to keep them away from me. In fact, she encouraged them to spend time with me and Marie-Louise, who had officially become my wife. To my surprise, and my relief, Marie-Louise and my daughters got along wonderfully. After a family trip to Euro Disney in Paris, they became close, laughing together, bonding in ways I never could have imagined. It was a far better outcome than I had dared to hope for. One day my daughters told me something that truly made me realize how far we had all come. Mom says she wants us to be good friends with Marie-Louise. That single sentence meant everything. It wasn't just about closure, it was about healing. A new beginning. Marie-Louise and I built a new life together, one built on honesty, trust, and understanding. We had our own fantasies, sure, every couple does. But we both agreed that some things were better left as just that, fantasies. We knew what truly mattered, and we never let our minds wander too far from what was real. She meant everything to me, and she never let me doubt how much I meant to her. "You are the love of my life," she told me one night. "And you always will be." I believed her. Because unlike my past, this time I had no reason to question it. I had always believed that trust was the foundation of any relationship. But as I learned the hard way, sometimes trust is misplaced. The struggles we faced. Grace and I had been trying to have a baby for 3 years with no success. She had always told me that our conflicting work schedules were to blame. She worked 4 days a week, with grueling 13-hour shifts that alternated between Monday through Thursday. Every 4 weeks her schedule changed, sometimes days, sometimes nights. She assured me that eventually our schedules would align with her cycle, and things would work out. But after years of waiting, I decided enough was enough. That spring we both underwent medical testing to figure out what was wrong. After multiple tests, the doctor gave us an answer: nothing. There was no medical reason preventing us from conceiving. That should have been a relief. But instead it left me with more questions. The first clue. One evening I noticed something odd. A foil packet of birth control pills sat on the bathroom counter. At first I thought it was an old pack. But as I looked closer, I realized the days of the week on the pills matched the current date. Why would she still be taking these if we were trying to have a baby? I felt my stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. Later that night she came home from work, exhausted. I watched her undress in the bedroom, her clothes scattered carelessly where she dropped them. A strange feeling washed over me, something I couldn't shake. Almost on instinct I picked up her underwear. They were still damp. I quickly placed them back under her robe and returned to bed, pretending to be asleep. But in that moment I realized something. There was a hidden side to her that I had never known. I needed more answers. The night I found out. A few nights later, I decided to go to her workplace. I told myself I just wanted to ease my doubts, to prove that I was overthinking things. But what I found shattered me. I ended up outside one of the break rooms where doctors take their short rests during long shifts. As I stood there, I could hear the unmistakable sounds of people being intimate inside. I had to know. I needed to find out who was in that room. I couldn't just walk in, so I searched for a hiding place. A few feet away, I found an open janitor's closet, just close enough to watch the door without being seen. For 20 agonizing minutes I waited. Then the door opened. Grace walked out, adjusting her scrubs as she headed toward the parking garage. I felt my entire world collapse. A little while later, another figure emerged. A man. He locked the door behind him and walked off in the opposite direction, completely unaware that I had seen everything. The truth I couldn't ignore. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. Every excuse I had made for her over the past few months suddenly crumbled. The birth control pills. The exhaustion. The distance between us. The feeling that something was off. It had never been about our schedules. It had never been about bad timing. Grace had never wanted to have a baby with me at all. She had been lying to me, cheating on me, living a double life right under my nose. And now there was no way to deny it. I had no intention of confronting the man Grace had been with. There was no point. But as fate would have it, I crossed paths with him anyway. I approached him casually, asking for directions. He was a bit taller than me, confident but unsuspecting. He gave me the information I asked for, completely unaware that I knew exactly who he was and what he had done. That night, as I sat in my computer room, saving important files for the weeks ahead, I knew my time in that house was coming to an end. At exactly 9:30 p.m., Grace arrived home right on schedule. We exchanged greetings as if nothing had changed, as if she wasn't living a lie. She went straight to the shower and then to bed, never once questioning my presence, never sensing how distant I had become. I also went to bed early, but I lay awake for hours, realizing how little she noticed me anymore. Maybe she had already written me off in her mind, or maybe she thought she had gotten away with everything. Either way, I knew it was over. The departure. The next morning, Grace left the house early as usual. Shortly after, the movers arrived right on time. I had a checklist of everything I needed to take with me. My new place was already set up, and in 60 days I would be putting the house on the market. Anything left behind would be donated to Goodwill. As I walked through the house one last time, I placed an envelope on the dining table. Inside was my wedding ring and a note. Now you're free to do as you please. I wonder, does he have a wife? A family? Because if he does, she will find out eventually. What will the hospital say when they hear about this? Remember when I said I wouldn't tolerate infidelity? Consider this your warning about what's coming next. Not your husband anymore. John. With that, I walked out of the house for the last time, leaving behind nothing but memories, both good and bad. The fallout. Grace tried to salvage the situation. She suggested counseling, claiming we could work through this. Max, my lawyer, saw right through it. He didn't understand why she was even asking. What's the point? She's still actively seeing the guy, he pointed out. And he was right. When we stood before the judge, I made it clear that I wouldn't be participating in any court-mandated counseling. I don't care if you threaten me with jail time, I told the judge. My wife was unfaithful, dishonest, and deceitful. I have no desire to be near her, let alone sit in a room and pretend to fix something that's already broken beyond repair. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, but the real storm was only just beginning. The video that changed everything. Someone, an anonymous source, leaked security footage of Grace's affair at the hospital. The video spread like wildfire, creating a scandal that no one saw coming. Grace called me furious. Why would you do this? She demanded. I simply laughed. There's no proof I leaked anything. But whoever did, well, I owe them a drink. I reminded her that I had warned her, I would not tolerate infidelity, especially when it was thrown in my face. And even after I filed for divorce, she had continued the affair. You broke 2 marriages, Grace. It could have been worse, I told her. Surprisingly, she agreed. The aftermath. The fallout was worse than she had anticipated. Her family turned against her. Friends who once admired her now looked at her with disgust. The affair didn't just end our marriage, it destroyed the image she had built for herself. Eventually, she packed up and moved to Oklahoma City, where she found a job working as a nurse in a private doctor's office. Maybe she was trying to rebuild her life, trying to escape the shame. I can only hope she learned from her mistakes. As for me, I moved on. And I never looked back.